Sometimes any decision is better than no decision. So there are actually different types of decisions you can do. The first type is the decision you just don't do, you just don't make, which is also a decision. It's the decision basically to not decide, but not thinking about not deciding. The second one is to try to make the right decision. And this is obviously what you always should strive to do, because that's basically just optimization. And the third thing is also optimization. Obviously, it's just that the optimization is not basically a traditional optimization, because it also implies just making a decision you kind of know is wrong, but nevertheless you make the decision because you know that not making the decision would be even worse. So therefore it's also just an optimization, obviously, but nevertheless for actually differentiating between the different kind of decision, it makes sense to at least first of all not paint it as it would be, as it makes sense not to present it as if it was just an optimization, because in the end it's an optimization anyway. You try to make the best out of anything, and that's the mathematical process of finding the ideal point in any given scenario. So basically, if you take a look at almost all things, then what you can do is to just try to build a function, just try to build a model, which basically is nothing else than simplifying reality down into the main variables, so the main factors that actually influence your decision, and you just try to basically optimize the outcome of this function. And now the thing is, often it's just too complex. This means you cannot really compute a proper solution. This then means that obviously the model is just too complex. Therefore, you actually need to find a simpler model. Because if you don't find a simpler model, you just don't find a solution, because you already tried and it didn't work. So therefore, sometimes the optimal point can be also not the optimal point. I mean, that's obvious, because you just cannot find always the optimal point. Especially when it comes to decisions like decisions that are not like, especially when it comes to decisions we actually have to do in everyday lives. We cannot find the optimal point. Therefore, it's not that we cannot find, it's kind of wrong to say it like this. At the same time, it's kind of right. So therefore, let's try to explain. I try to explain it again. You cannot always find the optimal point, but it doesn't mean that the solution you then find is not optimal, because the optimal point is basically not implying the variable time, for example. It's not implying the variable computation power and the limited resources you have. So therefore, if you also take these into account, if you also factor in these other variables you didn't previously take into account because your model was just too ideal, then it again is just an optimization process. And now, this is where the paradox kind of hits us. It means that we often have to make decisions which are not optimal. We kind of accept solutions that are not optimal, but nevertheless we just accept these solutions as not optimal because we know that we just didn't have the time to optimize these. We just couldn't build a model that's easy enough in order for us to actually compute these things. Or the model we built was too complex, therefore we just simplified it, even though we know that with this simplification a huge chunk of the actual predictability, not the predictability, but much more the prediction power of a model basically is lost. So in an ideal world, I mean, not in an ideal world, but an ideal model obviously would have a predictive power that would basically predict the reality. But the reality is most often too complex. This means that a is nothing else than a simplification of reality. The key now is to just find the variables, then by including these variables, the prediction power actually is as high as it possibly can. And at the same time, not trying to make the model as too complex to compute. And therefore, as a final resolution, trying to always find the optimal solution is already basically the optimal approach, even though it sometimes means that we don't feel right about something. Because, I mean, sometimes we have to just make a decision. We make a decision anyway. The decision to procrastinate on a decision is also kind of a decision. It's not like a decision in the way we think of decisions, but if you think of a decision as a point in time that has different outcomes, then basically every single point in time where we decide whether to do things, whether we not do things, are basically these decision points. And that's basically the final resolution. It's not that there is no right decision. The right decision is obviously trying to make the optimal decision. But nevertheless, we often, which also implies that we sometimes have to make decisions which are not optimal in our eye, but they are, because they also are implying the limited resources we have.